Thank you, Jeff, very much. And thank you to Steve and to Gary for having us today. Um, I had just a couple comments to start with, and I didn't have an opportunity to see Jeff's slides, but one thing I was going to mention just with respect to musicians, some musicians are in a position where they can do it for a career. Most do it as a second job or as a hobby or whatever. But what I have found is pretty consistently, I had a opportunity. This is 30 years ago, to hire a financial analyst, and the two final um, candidates were one from GW, one from University of Maryland. GW was a finance major, really smart guy, would have made a really good financial analyst. And then the other candidate was an accounting degree with a major, a double major, and his second major was music. And I hired him. And that's when I learned that what music can really do for an individual. And Jeff described some of the things. And, I just wrote a couple things down. They're good problem solvers, they're excellent listeners, they are exceptionally good team players. You have to play in a quartet and be coordinated. They're very good at seeing what's in front of them, but expecting what's coming next because you got to begin to flip the page for the next things. And so the mindset and the thinking and the abilities of musicians to me is just outstanding. And just coincidentally, we just hired a financial planner out of Towson, and she plays the flute. And from the beginning, when she told me that, I said, "You've got an edge on getting this position right away because we are always looking to hire somebody that's got an arts or a music background." Anyways, so I wanted to mention that, and then. That's it. I just wanted to make sure I thanked everybody, including everybody in attendance today. Um, I think a critical part of making sure that you're in a position to take care of your family, to manage your wealth, to do all the things that we want to do with respect to financial planning, wealth management, estate planning, is to be informed and being educated. And so I think taking time on a Saturday morning here, I commend you for coming here. There was a trying to think. It was a retailer. I'm old enough to remember, and maybe some others are too. There was a couple in Baltimore. There was one over in Rockville, and I think Tyson's Corner. And the company was out of New Jersey, and the founder was Cy Sims, and it was the Sims Corporation, and it was a sort of a discount retailer, and they did commercials all the time. But their slogan was one that always stuck with me, and that was an educated consumer is our best customer. And so for you to take the time today to become more educated, to become more informed, I think makes it much easier for you to make sure that you really accomplish the goals for your family. And it makes it much easier us for help to implement a lot of the things that need to be done to make sure that you accomplish your goals. So just housekeeping real quickly. You can answer, I can ask questions anytime. We're happy to answer them. And then I think we're going to run a full 50, but we'll do our best to leave some time for Q&A. So if you want to catch us in between for questions, please feel free to do so. So what are we going to cover today? We're going to go over the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, and then what its impacts are to some charitable planning. Uh, we have this view of always taking a comprehensive approach, and so we just want it's sort of outside specifically some of the topics we're talking about today, but I want to show you how it sort of ties into it. Go over some key concepts, look at some charitable planning tools and some ideas relative to that, and then finally we'll do some examples and calculations that helps bring the all of this information into context and how it works. So, presenting today will be Dan and myself. Billy's here just to sort of keep it straight, make sure we don't tell any lies, and then I just want to do a quick introduction. Dan, so one thing I would say to you that sometimes gets glossed over is because we all have these various letters after our name, and in our opinion, those letters are critical because we think working with somebody that's competent and that has proven that they want to stay up to date and educated and remain competent have these designations. And so Dan is a certified financial planner. He's a certified, a chartered financial analyst, and he's also a certified private wealth advisor. Those are very, elite designations within our industry. Billy is a certified financial planner and also a certified private wealth advisor. And then I'm a CFP, which I started with Stegman and Company, the CPA firm out of Towson, Maryland, in 1984. So it's been amazing. It's been that long, but I've been doing tax and accounting work since that time. And then I entered the wealth management firm or industry maybe 33 years ago or so. It says 2 decades. We were talking earlier. They wanted to put 3. I said, just leave it 2, because earlier in life you want it to be a larger number, and then later in life you sort of want to lower the number a little bit. So I told them 2 is still accurate, even if it was 4. So a couple things. Let me just see. I missed one page of my notes. Excuse me. So a little bit about Dan. Dan is the company geek. That's a compliment. Dan truly will put an Excel worksheet together that will absolutely confuse you, and it makes absolutely good sense. And it's not the fact that he can do it; it's the fact that he enjoys doing it and looks for opportunities to do it. Conversely, when we have our team meetings or we're sitting around the conference room, Dan is sort of our class clown. And this weekend, his dear wife Christy is traveling, so he has 3 beautiful young children. So he is playing Mr. Mom for the weekend, and he's
Don't ask me where they are though.
yeah, that's right. I think they're not out in the.
They're in the car.
They're in the car. Yes. I wasn't sure. Right. That's funny.
Cold enough. I think
Funny.
they'll be okay.
So Dan has all the skills that I described earlier that you typically see in a musician, and it just so happens that Dan is a musician and he plays the guitar, and so just sort of reinforces my whole generalization relative to.
And to be clear, he did not tell me about the PRS before he decided to make the donation, so I didn't have the opportunity to make a call for it. So.
Oh, that's funny. I thought you were going to play like the first 6 drums of Smoke on the Water for us. So
Set the stage.
and then Billy. So an interesting thing about Billy is that this is his last week in the world as a single man. So next Saturday, actually right here, not just down the road in Ellicott City, he will be a married man. And yes, thank you. And he has a keen interest in estate planning. Oops, I switched my thing. And you can see some of the other specialties there. And then he's also very good at giving his dad the eye when I'm talking too much. So he I look at him and he's like, cut. And so he'll keep me on track here. And I say that half facetiously, but it really does happen. So that's our team. Okay, so just a quick summary of, I'm going to call it the bill because I get tired of saying the OBBBA. So the bill.
We do OBA. OBA was a pretty
OBA,
good.
oh, is that a new one? Oh, okay, I didn't hear that.
That was good. We do that.
So there was some legislation passed back in 2017, and when they pass legislation nowadays, sorry, I'll stay closer to the mic. I apologize. When they pass legislation, there used to be a time when you'd pass legislation and it just sort of stayed in place. Now there's various phase outs and sunsets, and so they'll put a law in place, but it'll only be good for 6 years. And so you always have to consider when these phase outs are implemented, or when when the sunsets end. And so there was several of those built into the 2017 law, most of which were due to end January 1st of 2026. So the new law, the new act, either extended those or made those permanent. And so that actually provided a lot of relief in a lot of areas, and we'll go into the detail a little bit. So, it has, I'm only going to cover some of the items that I think are probably more relevant. There was several things in there that we sort of left off because it gets into too much detail. But if you have a question on one that's not on here, please feel free to ask. Big changes to income taxes, favorable. Some changes to itemized deductions. There's some things specifically written in there that are associated with charitable planning. And then, the most significant change probably is that, we had this federal tax exemption amount that was it was 5.5 million in 2016. The 2017 bill like doubled it to 11 million roughly. With inflation, it's gone up to close to 14 million this year, and then starting next year, it would revert back to 7,500,000 or some number close to that. That is no longer the case. We now have a permanent, in quotes, right? Because permanent in tax law is really never permanent. It's till the next administration or to whatever the next thoughts are. But as of right now, there's no expiration on that $15 million. $15 million exempted from state taxes for both spouses, so $30 million in total. And then it's sort of like there's some of the changes are permanent, some of them are temporary, some of them happen immediately, and some of them happen starting in 2026. So I'm going to go through some of the key ones now. So the income tax brackets were supposed to increase, and with the highest bracket going at 39%, the law kept the brackets just where they are today, so that was a good change. In the very beginning, you heard things about no tax on tips. We're going to not tax Social Security. Don't tax overtime. Well, what was initially proposed and what ended up happening ended up being a little bit different, but I think essentially to a large degree it did accomplish what they were trying to do to a great extent. And so there's a senior deduction now that is starts this year, ends in 2025, that if you're over 65 or over, you get to take an above the line, meaning you don't have to itemize, a $6,000 deduction off your tax return. Just right off your tax return, you reduce your income by $6,000, and it's eligible for both spouses, and so it's $12,000. As I mentioned earlier, all of these provisions, or at least most of them, are subject to phase outs, and I'm not going to go through the phase outs because they're all different amounts, but once you hit a phase out amount is when the benefit gets reduced, and in some cases it gets eliminated. But that's a new provision. It's effective 2025, and it could be quite effective. It's $12,000 off your potentially your taxable income. They increased the child and dependent care from I think it was $2,000. They increased it to $2,200, so that was a good change. The items that don't have a second date on them means there's no sunset on them, so that is just a permanent change that they made. A significant change is state and local income taxes, particularly for us in Maryland, because we have one of the higher income tax states in the country, and so when the 2017 Act was put in place in the beginning of 2019, you were not allowed to deduct more than $10,000 in state and local income taxes, and that included your real estate taxes. And so you really got essentially no benefit from any state taxes you paid. Starting this year and going through 2029, this is the only one that has that 2029 versus 2028. So we got an extra year. You can actually take up to $40,000 in your state and local taxes. So that does open up some opportunities. Again, there's some phase outs, but it might give you the ability to where you took the itemized deduction, took the standard deduction previously. Now you could take an itemized deduction and add it to you've got your medical, you've got your state and local taxes, you have your mortgage interest expense, and then you have your charitable. That's all sort of the itemized deductions. And a lot of times before, because it was only $10,000 in the state, it wasn't worth it because you got $31,000 anyways as a standard deduction. So most people, even today, most people take the standard deduction. They don't itemize on their federal tax return. But now that we've got $40,000, if you have a high state income tax amount, then there's some consideration as to whether you can now itemize that and get a better tax benefit. As I mentioned earlier, under the estate tax, the exclusion, that should say estate tax exclusion, not exclusion tax exclusion. The estate tax exclusion increased to $15 million. And so, again, it's increased $15 million today. We know for the next several years it'll be there. There's always the potential later it could come back down. But right now, I forget what the stats are, but based under current legislation, I think there's only 7,000 estate taxes that are estates that are subject to taxes each year. So it's a reasonably small amount relative to the population in the country. The next three, I think, do a pretty good job for like middle income, particularly younger individuals. Overtime deduction, it's the half portion. So if you get paid time and a half, the amount that you get paid for the half, you don't have to pay tax on it, and that's up to 12,500 for a single person and up to $25,000 for an individual. So so for particularly younger folks where there's people still working in the service industry and they're still working on tips, I think it really could help them significantly. Um, and The same with tips. In the service industry, getting tips, you can exclude 25,000, irrespective of whether you file joint or single. It's a 25,000 deduction, and so both of those I think could help tremendously. And then lastly, car interest is deductible again. There's some restrictions as the car has to be assembled in the U.S. and some other things, but you get up to $10,000 a year um, right off your taxes. If you purchase a car and you finance it, the government will help subsidize it through allowing you to write some of it off against your income taxes. Um, the key thing about a lot of these is these are above the line, so they're not itemized deductions. So irrespective of whether you itemize or not, you get to take these deductions. The state and local taxes is that's part of the itemized deductions, but the senior tax, the overtime deduction, tips deduction, those all go above the line, and you're entitled to those irrespective of whether you decide to itemize in your federal return. Um, so, a couple key provisions that impact charity. I do have a typo on this. I apologize. In the top right there, where it says 2025 plus, that should be 2026. That's sort of a critical one, but um, so there's a new charitable write-off that's allowed now. Again, this is not an itemized; you get it irrespective, and it's on the front of your 1040, and you can put in a line for either 1,000 or 2,000, whether you're single or married, and that's just a write-off in your tax returns. No offsets, no phase out. That's just a deduction you get. My thought sort of on that is it can capture a lot of the it has to be in cash. It can't go to a donor advised fund, and it has to go to a public charity. And so the smaller checks, a lot of times we write where we write it to the local fire department or to whomever. It's a great place to capture all those and get a nice tax benefit for it. So um, the next two are pretty critical and can have some significant impacts just depending on your circumstances. Uh, the Prior to the 2017 law, only 50% of your charitable contributions were essentially allowed to be deducted, and you could carry it forward after that. But the uh, 2017 law made it 60%. It was supposed to revert back. The new law keeps it at 60%. So that's a positive. However, now, if you make a charitable contribution and you're going to itemize that charitable contribution, starting in 2026, you have to go over a floor amount. And that floor is taken based on your adjusted gross income, which is sort of your total income on the front of the 1040. You multiply it times 0.5%. And then anything above 0.5%, you get to take. Anything that's below that, you just lose the benefit. And so we're going to talk a little bit about maybe some reasons on bringing some of your charitable contributions into 2025 just so you don't hit that floor. And another related item to that is the highest tax bracket right now is 37%. And so if you get a tax write-off of any type, itemized deduction or otherwise, you essentially get 37 cents back on every dollar that you spend. But what they've done now is say, we won't give you the full 37. So if you're in a 37% bracket, which I didn't look, but I think it's 750,000 or something. So it's a fairly high number. Then you only get 35%. So your itemized deductions, if you're on the higher income side and you're making a larger charitable contribution, get impacted fairly significantly starting just in a couple of months. And that's where we bring the idea in of maybe getting those contributions done this year. QCDs, by the way, are not impacted by that, and we'll discuss that as well. So I think I had two client examples just because sometimes when you hear a story, it helps. And so the increase in the exemption amount to $15 million, we made deliberate efforts to put assets in irrevocable trust that would bypass the estate tax. And now we have clients that will clearly never be subject to it just based on their age and based on their current law. So we have assets in irrevocable trust that have less favorable income tax provisions. They don't get a step up in basis, for example. The tax rate on the trust is higher than a regular. And so we're looking for ways to get the money out, because if we can get the assets distributed, particularly if they're securities that have been there for a long time that have embedded gains, you buy the S&P at 100 and now it's at 200. If it gets distributed from the irrevocable trust, it's subject to gains. If we can get it distributed back out to one of the beneficiaries, they can then keep it and then pass it to their children and not pay any taxes. And so that's sort of what we're trying to do. And then additionally, Dan was mentioning we had the opportunity with one client that had charitable intents that the assets that were in the irrevocable trust were really the best assets to use because they were highly appreciated. And so we were fortunate enough that the distribution provisions in this trust allowed us to just take all the holdings. So it's just a bunch of mutual funds and exchange traded funds, and we just took them out of the trust and made a distribution of principal and put them into a revocable trust for the client. So now the client owns them and has full control over them. There's other reasons sometimes you don't want to do that I won't go into today, like asset protection and other, but that wasn't the case here. And so by doing so, now we have a client that has the ability to take some of those shares, donate it to charity, leave some to her family. The family gets it without any embedded gain, and it worked out for everybody. And the other thing I was going to mention, do I want to mention the change in the income for the 5% floor, or we're going to cover that?
No, we'll
Cover that later. All right, very good.
So how are we doing on time?
Okay. The other thing I was going to mention, this is like a general, and I mentioned it earlier, is if you pay quarterly taxes, and you might be able to take up to the $40,000 now allowed on the SALT deduction, the state and local income taxes, you need to look at when you pay your tax. A long time ago, we did this all the time. When state taxes used to be fully deductible, there was no limit. And so we would look each year and run a projection, usually in the fourth quarter, as to what the tax liability was. You have to pay your state taxes by January 15th, generally. And sometimes we would bring that forward and pay it in December at the end of the previous year. And by doing so, we get the tax benefit in the year where it is more beneficial. And so as you're looking at the end of this quarter, it might make sense, if you're otherwise eligible, to either pull forward the amount or possibly push it back if you might get the benefit in 2026. And I am going to stop there for a second. If there's any questions, please feel free to ask now. I'd be happy to answer. And then Dan's going to go over what our firm does from a planning perspective, taking a comprehensive approach.
Yep. I think we did have I'll take the remote. Oh, looks like we do have a question.
Oh, yes. Sorry. Yes.
Are the slides going to be made available? Yes. And
Yes.
if I'm wrong, I got the information incorrect.
That's right. Billy was looking real carefully at him when he said that. Like, yes. No, the other thing is, we'll provide a reference to there's an organization called the Tax Foundation, and they have a couple really good write-ups that summarize a lot of the major changes to based on the OBBBA, and also where you can put in your personal information, and it gives you an idea of where you may benefit from the tax law changes.
Sure.
Just offhand for the senior adjusted gross income, do you know what that is for the 6,000?
I think it's 150.
I think it is it's 75 single, 150 if you're. So it phases out starting at 150. 150, yeah.
So
that one, it seems, should have been kept a little higher, but who knows when they get into these negotiations. Like every phase out was different. Well, the tips and the overtime were the same, but a lot of the other ones they just had these numbers in there that I don't know exactly where they got them. For example, the $40,000 phase out starts at 500,000, but the senior phase out starts at 150,000, and don't know why they made those decisions.
So, well, good. Well, as Bill mentioned, the one thing that we wanted to do is sort of set the stage, because charitable planning is obviously the focus of our conversation today, but I guess comparable to other sort of subject matters that may be important to a client, it's, well, we would argue it is impossible to try to view any planning item in its isolation. And so other things sort of drive decisions or may impact other decisions. And then not everybody's charitably inclined, right? And so oftentimes we have to we sort of say, set the game plan, which is just, what are we trying to accomplish in this particular meeting or with your planning? But it always begins with a review of their goals, objectives, and concerns. And so, again, some of these topics may not be applicable to an individual, but oftentimes charitable planning does come in. Now, everybody has different sort of degrees of charitable inclination. There's also a mix, right? You have individuals that sort of want to have more of a passive exposure, right? So they're donating cash and sort of walking away. You have others that are more actively involved in charities, so they might participate in a food bank or help clean the Severn River as part of the Severn River Association, or a mix of the two. And so sort of understanding sort of what their philanthropic, initiatives are can help us drive sort of the tax planning benefits, because I haven't had anybody ever tell us that they don't want the government to share in some of their charitable endeavors, right? And so that's essentially what we're trying to do. I sort of say in jest with some clients that there's really no economic benefit to donating to charity, which is not true, right? But some people are like, well, how much should I donate to charity to save on income taxes? And I like, take a step back and let's just make sure that's something that's important to you so that you get both, right? The sort of the good feeling of helping other individuals or helping other initiatives, as well as receiving the tax benefit. So we threw up an example of sort of our typical templated agenda, but you can see that everything sort of needs to get addressed before we start talking about charitable planning. And you're going to get into some examples as to how different circumstances may lead to different ways of satisfying charitable endeavors. So,
And
Uh,
and then I just want to get back up again. That so when we first engage with a client, we'll often have with a prospective client, we'll often have a specific question relating to one issue. I'd like to create a revocable living trust or whatever it may be, and then we just that's when we tell them that if you're going to make that decision, you need to make that decision in the context of considering all these other things. So every client that comes to us, this is not the exact agenda, but this is essentially the agenda we use for planning for every client, because we think you have to consider all this before you can make a decision on any of them, just because there's so much, they're intertwined so closely. And the other thing I was going to mention is the summary of the year-end plannings. That's in the beginning of the year, we say, "All right, this year, let's plan on what we need to do by the end of the year." When we meet with them on October 19th, we move that to the top of the list because we want to make sure if we need to get things implemented for the end of the year that we identify them sooner.
yeah, no, that's good. And obviously, it is that time of the year, and so it does become pretty important. As we get to some examples, tax laws change, and so we want to make sure that we take advantage of how those evolve over time. So, and it does. It's mostly clients come and say, "I need help with retirement planning," and we're like, "Well, let's take a step back because other things may impact some of those decisions." So, the one thing that we like to start with is a balance sheet. This is not my spreadsheet. Mine look much better than this, by the way. I don't use Calibri.
It was
I'm
my
amateur.
spreadsheet.
Yeah, that's a Bill spreadsheet for sure. Especially since, no, I'm kidding. But
Especially since it doesn't add up.
yeah, it doesn't add up on the bottom. We're hoping nobody notices that 11 plus this subtraction is not this number, but it looks good on paper, so that's how we make people feel better about themselves. No, I'm kidding.
And it
But-
made it through compliance.
and it made it through compliance somehow. They found other things, but not our typos or our math problems. So, but ultimately, why we go through this exercise is a couple things. And how does it relate to charitable planning is important as well. There's obviously a number of things that we can glean from a balance sheet. Things like, do we have adequate liquidity? How much exposure do we have to pre-tax IRAs? How much of your residence in conjunction with your other assets Are we sort of lopsided? So does Betty have more assets than Tom, or vice versa? That may cause some estate tax issues that we want to address. Are there any other things that sort of stand out? Obviously, they have a really nice, 3 1/8 mortgage right there. So, if they came to us and said we want to pay that off, we might try to convince them not to. But you get the idea that, from a comprehensive approach, just you saying, I want to donate to charity, I want to be more active in my participation is a hard thing to answer when we don't have all the information. And then the next step is to go through that same exercise just with your cash flows, right? And so this is actually just a sample case, just 5 years or so of just projected cash flows. From a tax planning perspective, we can glean a lot of things from this. Like, is there lumpiness in income or expenses that may present certain tax planning opportunities? Are required minimum distributions expected to come in the next few years, Social Security, things of that nature? So again, a lot of things that can help us sort of prescribe what we think is a more tax advantageous approach to donating to charity. And then the beneficiary designations, I think this is probably the most overlooked. Obviously not within this group, I would assume, just because you're all clients. You have an estate planning attorney, which we appreciate you doing, because oftentimes we recommend clients to do it, and what do? They don't do it, right? And so they meet with us 2 years later, and we're like, where do you stand with your estate plan? And they're like, oh, we're getting to it, right? And we're like, well, when? And we will call Steve and get the time on the books tomorrow. But one of the most important things that is often overlooked or not looked at enough, I would say, are things like beneficiary designations. Even small things, when we're working with a new client, oftentimes you're like, you can't tell us too much. Like, don't hold back. Anything that's you might think is sort of immaterial, like, oh, I own shares of Duke Energy from my dad, or sitting at CompuShare. I'm like, well, what are they worth? She's like, maybe $1,200. And I'm like, well, how are they titled? She's like, I have no idea. Right? And so you might do all this estate planning work with Steve or another attorney, and then all of a sudden you just opened yourself up to potentially some hassles when it comes to estate settlement, just because on something you thought was immaterial. And even like checking accounts, like if you own things in your individual name versus jointly with your spouse, like just getting something simple as, oh, this is not legal advice. I was supposed to say that, right? So, but best practices that we've heard from very competent attorneys are things like transfer on death or beneficiary, or payable on death beneficiary designations. But the most important thing as it relates to charitable planning is if we have these, like you can see here, all these like pre-tax retirement accounts. So in this couple, in this example, you have a 401k, a 403b, and an IRA, all are pre-tax, which means you haven't paid tax on them yet. But what does the IRS want? Taxes, right? And so, well, they don't want taxes. They want to collect the taxes. But what we want to do is, if you come to us and say, hey, we have some charitable intent, and a lot of that is at when we dock, because maybe we just want to make sure that our lifestyle is not compromised during retirement. We want to enjoy ourselves. To the extent there's anything left over, we would like it to go to charity. Our kids are fine. Well, pre-tax retirement accounts, and we'll get into that a little bit, are some of the best assets to leave the charity at death. And so ultimately, if we have an idea as to, where, obviously in this case, they have the donor advised fund. The DAF is donor advised fund. We'll get into some specifics later, but you can see that there's some opportunity there. It can also, and this is sort of a side note, but it's not charitably inclined, but it can also open up conversations around maybe potential beneficiaries that shouldn't receive assets outright, right? And so there may be some supportive needs of a child that has governmental assistance programs, but they don't want to receive retirement assets. Or maybe there's some issues with substance abuse or spendthrift issues that there may be a better approach to making sure they're taken care of without giving them the outright exposure. Is that right? Yeah, perfect. So that's why this is important to go through the whole approach. So,
And Dan, real quickly, related to if you could flip back one, I'm sorry. So a real live case, prospective client in Easton, and I think this happens fairly commonly, is your will or your revocable trust tends to be the device that has the positive provisions for your estate. And so in your will, you put, I'd like a third to go to my local church or whatever organization, and the rest go to the children. And then you have an IRA account that has a spouse primary and my 3 children as equal beneficiaries. And what's missing there is that the children, if they were left assets outside of the retirement plan, would typically get a step up in basis, and when they got that asset, they wouldn't have to pay any tax on it. They could sell it immediately without any embedded gain in it. And then conversely, if you just took all the language related to charity to the extent it meets your needs out of your planning documents and just use your beneficiary designations, it's so much easier. And you don't have to. We would sometimes, like, if Robert didn't want to leave the 422, we would just make that 2 IRAs, because he may just say, I'll only leave $400,000 to the charity. Oh, so I'm sorry. Yeah. So what I was explaining is, if you don't want to leave the entire amount, we have the ability to split the account. And so for the last example, where it's Robert's traditional IRA, it's 922,000, and Robert says, I just want to leave 400,000. What we'll do is open up another IRA, and we'll keep one account designated for the charity and the other account designated to whomever he wants, typically the kids. And actually, I think that's it. I had one more thought, but I couldn't think of it. So
That's okay. We're short on time anyway. No, I'm kidding.
I know her.
So I'm going to go through some food for thought and some things, just some largely related to charitable planning, but just some things that we sort of bring up and sort of our just sort of day to day with clients. As Bill sort of mentioned, the 501c3 eligible charities obviously are not largely subject to income taxes, so that presents some opportunities. Whether or not you itemize, as Bill had mentioned early on, I'd say the majority of individuals are using the standard deduction, but to the extent that you itemize because of maybe the SALT deduction increases, might present some opportunities. Income in respect to decedent is, or we call it IRD taxes. That's effectively the taxes that those that inherit basically your retirement accounts largely are going to end up paying. With the Secure Act that came out, obviously 5 or 6 years ago, and then this new iteration, those that inherit a pre-tax IRA are required to take a distribution every year, but within 10 years, empty the full amount. And so if you have children that are hopefully very successful, that could push them into some unfavorable tax amounts that may present some opportunity for you to essentially prepay at a lower income tax rate. So it's something that we want to take into account. Cash is typically the least favorable asset to donate to charity. Obviously, we have the $2,000 cash donation that's available next year. But to the extent that we have an IRA or we have some appreciated assets, that becomes a benefit. There's some things we call bracket stacking or filling marginal brackets up, so we won't get into some specifics related to that. Qualified charitable distributions have been around for maybe 20 odd years or so. They are something that could go away at any point in time. But for those of you that are older than, or at 70.5 or older, you may not be well, if you're getting up to your required minimum distribution age, so 73 or 75, you have the ability to actually offset the required minimum distributions with direct cash donations from your IRA account to charity, and it reduces it dollar for dollar. So it becomes, and it's above the line. So we'll get into some examples there. Donor advised funds are probably our most utilized charitable tool that we have out there. If you're not familiar with donor advised funds, it's effectively like sort of your personal charity where you can donate assets. It gives you some flexibility on things that we're going to talk about here in a little bit, but you can grant from that donor advised fund as you wish to the extent that it's an approved 501c3. And so for a lot of individuals that want to have some recognition, so it might be the Hufnell Charitable Fund or Hufnell Family Charitable Fund, when the charity receives it, that's what's written on the check. And then ultimately, if you do have an estate plan in place and charitable giving at death is something that's important to you, your charitable inclinations may change over time, but you don't have to necessarily update your estate documents. You can just change the beneficiaries of the donor advised fund and just name it within your estate documents. And then there's some other things that we'll get into as well as far as other tax planning. Required minimum distributions, I'm probably pretty sure everybody here is aware that the IRS does like to collect tax revenue on pre-tax retirement accounts. And so the rules have changed. So for those of you born in the 50s, your retirement age or R&D age is 73. For those of you born after 1960, that age is 75. But at that year, you are required to take out a certain proportion of your pre-tax retirement accounts every year, which offers some opportunity because one, your first year you take it's called your required beginning date. And so the year in which you turn 73 or 75, you actually have up until the April 1st of the following year to take your first R&D, which you have to take to the second year. So it's very limited, but there's some opportunity for clients that have a high income year, the first year of R&D, to go ahead and defer that potentially to a second year because they might be in a high income bracket this year. And then there's other estate planning and income tax related things, but I think we're going to probably cover most of them. Actually, number 19, I think this is going to become a little bit more prevalent and I think we're going to get in. I think there's going to be some coverage of the Maryland tax changes, but as Bill mentioned, Maryland is a great state if you have 3 young children in the public education system. So I appreciate everybody's hard-earned tax dollars. But it's becoming a little bit more costly to live here. And so there are some benefits if you donate to some permanent like community foundations in this area. So, but the one thing that we wanted to mention is that I do say OBBBA, and I'm always afraid I say one too many or one few of the E's. I like OBA. So there are some implications related to OBA that impact charitable planning. One is what we talked about, is the fact that there may be fewer people, well, we don't know. It could be a mix, it could be a wash, but I think with the SALT income deductions, there may be more individuals itemizing, but when we look back the last few years, the majority of clients were taking, especially if they own their home outright and they didn't have mortgage, or they didn't have large medical expenses that are also an itemized deduction, we were seeing a lot of standard deduction. What does that mean? That means if you donate to charity, it's not that you shouldn't, it's just that there's probably no immediate or any tax benefit associated with it, because you would have gotten it otherwise. So that sort of had some, I don't think that's really driven people to not donate to charity, but it's obviously will make giving to charity a little bit more attractive to the extent that more individuals are itemizing. Now we have that small above the line charitable donations, a lot of tithing, I think is going to end up having some income tax benefits. We mentioned the SALT cap increase. The other is the estate and gift changes. So the historically high federal estate tax exemption amount has made planning a little bit tricky for individuals, but a lot of like the more, I don't want to say esoteric, but more complicated trust planning that sort of satisfies 2 things. One, it can help mitigate estate taxes, but also satisfy charitable intent. It's sort of gone to the wayside just because it hasn't become as beneficial to clients, so the opportunity really isn't there. And so we may see that sort of continue as the estate tax is made permanently $15 million beginning next year. I like the permanent, right? Yeah, it's permanent until it's not, right? So some things to consider, this is a little bit of an overview. We're big fans of, there's a lot of benefit to donating appreciated security. So what do we mean by that? You bought something at $100 and a non-retirement account is now worth $200. It has appreciated $100. If you want to donate funds and you're like, I'm going to donate cash, we wouldn't want you to sell the $200, pay income tax or capital gains tax on that $100, and then donate the cash. The charity's not paying the income taxes. Donate the $200, and then we can use cash on the side to buy the security that we had just donated. And now we've just foregone those realized capital gains forever. And so that's a really valuable tool. QCDs we talked about, donor advised funds, charitable remainder trust and leads trust. That's where that I say esoteric, but it's a little bit more of a complex trust planning. Private foundations we don't see a lot of, or charitable gift annuities, but they are available and they are utilized. So I think we wanted to go through and use this a little bit to go through some examples. And I know we're running short on time, so I appreciate everybody's patience. Billy has done a great job of trying to keep us on track. You just haven't listened to him, even though he's standing right here. So qualified charitable distribution. So I mentioned this earlier. So direct transfer from IRA to charity. So most custodians, for those of you that have IRAs, can issue a checkbook on the IRA. So if you're over the age of 70 and a half, and we can talk about maybe pushing it back to your actual retirement or RMD age if you're not there yet, but you can write a check directly to charity. So the donor advised funds are sort of on the way, so we're sort of ignoring those for a second. Up to $108,000 offsets your taxable income dollar per dollar. So effectively, if your required distributions were $108,000 and you wrote $108,000 directly to charity, that is non-taxable, whether you take the standard deduction or you itemize. And where that becomes important, and we're going to get, well, actually, we're going to get into that in a little bit. Jumping ahead there. That's how fast I'm going to go through this. Here we go. And we can't, and those checks don't go to your donor advised fund. They have to go directly to charity. So that's one of the downsides is, I think, for those of you that are charitably inclined, is if you do a rather large donation to a charity, they're probably going to ask for that same amount the following year, the following year, the following, the following year, and the following year, and the following year. So, and then other charities that are comparable are going to be like, oh, they seem like they are charitably inclined. Let's jump on this charity train. So that's one of the downsides, is that it has to go directly to charity. Whereas the donor advised fund, you can sort of dole it out in small increments throughout, throughout time. So every year you can sort of manage those expectations. Um, One of the techniques that, and we won't go through this too detailed, but one of the techniques that really highlights the flexibility of donor advised funds is a technique we like to call charitable bunching. And this year is actually a year where we've probably seen it probably the most, right? Just in anticipation of what's going to happen in 2026. But charitable bunching just means, let's say you're charitably inclined, and you know, it's funny. We look at tax returns like doctors look at blood work. Like, we can learn a lot about you just by going through your tax returns, right? And so if we notice that over the last 2 or 3 years, you're donating roughly 20 to 30,000 to charity every year, maybe through cash, maybe through appreciated securities, maybe a combination of the two, we may say, well, is your anticipation or your preference to continue doing that in the future? And typically they'll say, yeah, of course. Why wouldn't it? And then we say, well, why don't we take the next 2 or 3 years? Because this year you're going to get the best tax benefit, right? And so again, we're not doing this for taxes, but if we're going to do it anyway, we might as well have the government share it, right? And so instead of doling it out 20, 30 each year, let's fast forward let's just say, in this example, I think we use 25. So we'll use 75 this year, right? And so when we talked earlier about like a comprehensive approach, one, we want to make sure that that doesn't put you in an economic, a place where you're not comfortable with. So if we've already sort of made sure that if you donated 75 and things sort of went awry in the future, no harm, no foul, but we can get the full benefit of this year. And the benefit of the donor advised fund is you don't have to donate the 75 this year. You can still do the 25 each subsequent year, but you get the immediate tax benefit in the year where it's the most beneficial for you. And in this example, we use 25. And so if you're donating 25, your standard deduction is 31.5, you're not getting any tax benefit that you weren't otherwise going to get. But if you get 75 in there, then you get the delta between the two as an additional deduction amount for itemized deduction. We good? Yep. So we will skip through charitable. So QCDs versus cash gifts. I think we sort of talked through this as well. QCDs are the best, I would say, arguably the best tool for those that are charitably inclined or are also subject to required minimum distributions. For the most part, who's here on Medicare? All right. So, well, maybe but the government has sort of set the rate at which your Medicare premiums are, right? And then they look back 2 years ago and say, if you've crossed certain thresholds, your Medicare premium is going to be higher for that particular year. So it's a 2-year look back. So that's called IRMA. We're going to get into that here in a second. But QCDs, anything above the line helps mitigate IRMA. And I'm probably just going to skip to that. Yeah, I think we have the IRMA in here. Nope. So I'll just use this as an example. So actually it's on the bottom right here. So IRMA stands for the income related monthly adjustment amount. So IRMA comes off a little bit better, right? It's probably the topic that's top of mind for most retirees, honestly, because when they end up getting their benefit statement for the year and then they see that their Medicare premiums are going up, they're wondering why, right? And the issue is these brackets aren't like a progressive bracket, right? If you're $1 over that IRMA bracket for the entire, 2 years from now, your entire year, your Medicare premiums could be $2,000 to $4,000 more, depending if you're married or filing single. And so that's it's one of the few times where I say there's no economic benefit to give it. That one is, right? Because if you donate $20 and you bring your IRMA bracket down, then you're saving $2,000 just by giving $20 to charity. And we have clients where every year, this is the geek side of me, where we're trying to project where IRMA brackets are going to be 2 years from now and try to mitigate that exposure. Because that's the worst feeling, is when you're $300 over that bracket and they have a whole year of higher Medicare premiums. We talked about bunching. This is a big one. I don't know. It's not going to be super prevalent because it is for those that are on the higher income earning side. In particular, we have one client that is very involved with a Genesee school up in, I think it's North Baltimore County. And he grants, well, he says he pledges, but we say it's a grant. He grants around 100,000 a year to the Genesee school, and that's for the next 4 or 5 years. Well, he makes considerable amounts of money, and so he's going to be absolutely impacted by both of these, right? The 35% cap and the 0.5% AGI floor. And so we're going to do all that charitable giving this year, and it's probably going to save him, I mean, 14,000 on the low end, as far as the difference, and then like you, as Bill mentioned, there $4,300 there. So that was a whole, everybody just graduated tax planning 401. So I appreciate your patience. But we do want to highlight that, well, one, obviously charitable giving is important. You should do it regardless of what tax savings you may potentially get. But individuals like us are here to say, hey, if you're not opposed to the government sharing some of the, some of the economic cost of the tax benefit, there's ways of navigating it and making it as efficient as possible. So I guess based on time, do we just want to open up for
Yeah,
questions?
I was gonna, there's a few things relative to, on one point on the Maryland, because there's several things I was gonna point out, and that is, we talked about the federal exemption amount, estate tax exemption amount going to $15 million. Maryland is not tied to that at all. It's $5 million. And so when we do planning and we have a client that's in that position, we still have to take into consideration some planning items to take care of the Maryland side. So I think I looked ahead at slides. I think we're going to cover that some more. And then let me just see. Yeah, that was it. That the rest of this. Well, I'll just stop right there. So, do we have time for a little Q&A, or we just?
Maybe two. One short win. No, keep. Just saying.
Yeah. Well, I think you have in a donor advised fund, death of the owner.
That's a great question. So most custodians, so like Schwab Charitable, Vanguard Charitable, Fidelity Charity, allow, really there's 3 options. One, you can specify a number of charities of which it goes to automatically. 2, you can put in what's called a successor director. So oftentimes we'll have parents that have their children act in the granting capacity of the donor advised. Obviously, they don't have any economic benefit, but they have the options of granting out based on sort of either your desires or their desires, or a combination of the two. So we have clients that'll do 50% will go to these 3 or 4 charities, and the other half will have a successor director or 2 successor directors, which are oftentimes children. So
And one follow-up, and you donor advised fund moving on or only
yeah, so you can have both of you as sort of the granting authority of the donor advised fund. That's oftentimes what we end up doing. Because if there is one spouse, something happens, then the other spouse can sort of take over based on their sort of preferences, and then it follows a successor route. So, and I have had a client with literally 8 charities and then like 4 or 5, so it can get as complex as you want. But it does make the estate planning process far simpler. If you do have like 8 charities, you don't want to name each one, and then one sort of irritates you, and you're like, hey, Steve, can you redraft my revocable trust to eliminate this one, or vice versa? So, well, yeah, never mind. Like that. Well, thanks,
Well,
everybody. We
thank you
appreciate
all.
the opportunity.
Thank you all so
Sorry.
much.